The morning sun filtered through the massive transparent dome of the Galactic Unity Academy, casting long shadows across the polished metal floors. Students from 100 different worlds walked through the corridors, their varied form creating a living tapestry of the universe's diversity. Some floated, some walked, some slithered, but all moved with the confidence of youth who believed they knew their place in the cosmos. Jihoon adjusted his glasses as he navigated through the crowd, his warm backpack heavy with books and datapads. He was used to the stairs by now. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, and many species still saw them as the fragile newcomers who needed special accommodations just to survive outside their homeworld. The other students gave him a wide berth, not out of respect, but out of a mixture of curiosity and mild contempt. He didn't mind. Jihoon had learned long ago that being underestimated had its advantages. While others dismissed humans as weak, he spent his time studying, learning, and quietly proving himself through his work. His grades were among the highest in his year, though few acknowledged it. To most of his classmates, he was just a quiet human boy who sat in the back corner of every class, always reading something. The advanced xenobiology classroom was already half full when Jihoon arrived. He took his usual seat near the back, away from the main groups. The room was divided in the way it always was, with species clustering together. The dragonkin occupied the center seats, their natural confidence and power making them the unofficial rulers of the social hierarchy. The Aquarians kept to the cooler left side of the room where the temperature controls were set lower. The crystalline beings from the outer rim preferred the right side where the lighting was softer. And then there were the humans, all three of them in this class, scattered in the back rows like forgotten afterthoughts. Jihoon pulled out his datapad and began reviewing his notes on thermal regulation systems. Today's lecture was supposed to cover how different species adapted to extreme environments. He had spent the previous night reading everything he could find on the subject, fascinated by the elegant solutions nature had created across the galaxy. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and the Dragonkin students entered in a group. They moved like royalty, and in many ways, they were. The Dragonkin Empire controlled 17 star systems and had been part of the galactic community for over 3,000 years. Their natural abilities made them formidable in almost any environment. They could breathe fire, survive in temperatures that would melt most metals, and their physical strength was legendary. Leading the group was Arya, her crimson horns catching alight as she laughed at something one of her friends said. Her scales shimmered with a golden undertone, marking her as coming from a high-ranking family. She carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told she couldn't do something. Other students moved aside automatically as she passed, acknowledging the unspoken hierarchy. Jihoon watched her for a moment, then returned to his datapad. He had no illusions about his place in this social structure. He was here to learn, not to make friends with people who saw him as inferior. Arya and her friends took their usual seats in the center of the classroom. There were 5 of them in total, all Dragonkin, all from influential families. Summon, Arya's closest friend, was discussing the upcoming thermal resistance competition. It was an annual event where students competed to see who could withstand the highest temperatures in the Academy's testing chambers. Dragonkin students had won every year for the past century. Professor Minho entered the classroom, his weathered face showing the signs of decades spent exploring the harshest environments in known space. He was human, one of the few human professors of the Academy, and he commanded respect through his experience rather than his species. He had survived things that would have killed most beings, and everyone knew it. The lecture began with a discussion of thermal adaptation. Professor Minho pulled up holographic displays showing how different species handled heat. The magma dwellers who lived in the cores of volcanic planets, the ice race who existed in the frozen wastes of dead worlds, and dozens of others. Each species had evolved perfect solutions to their environmental challenges. Then the professor pulled up an image of a human. Several students snickered. Humans looked so ordinary compared to the exotic adaptations of other species. No natural armor, no temperature resistance, no special abilities. Just soft skin and a body that seemed poorly designed for anything beyond their mild home planet. Humans, Professor Minho said, his voice carrying easily through the room, are perhaps the most interesting case of thermal adaptation in the known galaxy. More snickers. Even some of the human students looked uncomfortable, unsure if the professor was setting them up for embarrassment. Most species, The professor continued, evolve to specialize. You adapt to your environment and become perfect for that specific condition. Dragonkin can survive extreme heat. Aquarians thrive in cold water. But humans did something different. They evolved to be adequate in almost any condition. He pulled up data showing human temperature tolerance. Humans can survive in environments ranging from -40 degrees to +50 degrees Celsius with minimal equipment. They achieve this through a unique and, frankly, bizarre cooling system. A three-dimensional model of human skin appeared, showing the intricate network of sweat glands. While most species regulate temperature through behavior or natural resistance, humans actively cool themselves through evaporation. They secrete liquid through millions of pores, which then evaporates and removes heat from the body. It's inefficient, requires constant hydration, and seems like a poor design. The professor paused, letting the class absorb this information. But it has one incredible advantage. It means that a human can continue physical activity in heat that would force other species to stop and rest. They can maintain effort in conditions that would quickly exhaust beings with more traditional cooling methods. Jehun noticed several students glancing back at him. He kept his expression neutral, his eyes on the professor. In Earth's history, Professor Mio continued, humans practiced something called persistence hunting. They would select a prey animal and chase it, not sprint after it, but jog after for hours. The prey would run, then stop to cool down. The human would catch up, and the animal would run again. This would continue for 5, 6, sometimes 8 hours under the blazing sun. Eventually, the prey would collapse from heat exhaustion, while the human, though tired, could still function. The classroom was silent now. Even the Dragonkin students had stopped their casual conversations. The prey didn't die from injury, the professor said quietly. It died because it couldn't cool down fast enough. The human could. That's the hellish heat I want you to understand. Not the heat of fire or lava, but the heat of relentless, continuous effort that never stops. The lecture moved on to other topics, but Jehun noticed Arya looking back at him several times. Her golden eyes were thoughtful, calculating. He wondered what she was thinking, but pushed the thought aside. Dragonkin didn't concern themselves with humans except to demonstrate their superiority. After class, as students filed out toward the cafeteria, Jehun overheard Arya talking with her friends. They were discussing lunch plans, debating whether to eat in the regular cafeteria or the thermal testing lab, where the temperature was kept elevated for a species that preferred warmth. Let's go to the thermal lab, Salmon suggested. It's more comfortable anyway. Boring, Arya replied. Everyone goes there. One of the other Dragonkin students, a boy named Taeyong, laughed. What? You want to slum it with the cold-sensitive species in the regular cafeteria? I want to do something interesting, Arya said. Then her eyes landed on Jehun, who was walking several meters ahead, oblivious to their conversation. A slow smile spread across her face. I have an idea. A challenge. Her friends leaned in, interested. Challenges among Dragonkin were serious business, often involving displays of strength or endurance. See that human? Arya gestured toward Jehun. I'm going to sit next to him during lunch in the thermal lab, right next to him, like we're friends or something. Her friends stared at her. Why would you do that? Salmon asked. Because it'll be funny, Arya said with a grin. Everyone thinks humans are so fragile. I want to see how long he lasts in there before he has to leave. It'll be hilarious. Taeyong shook his head. You're crazy. Why would you waste your time? Because I'm bored, and this will be entertaining. Come on, you can all watch. I bet he doesn't last 10 minutes in there before he's sweating and begging to leave. Her friends exchanged glances, then shrugged. It seemed harmless enough, and Arya's challenges were always entertaining to watch. They agreed to meet at the thermal lab for lunch. Jehun remained unaware of the plan forming behind him. He headed toward the thermal lab cafeteria because it was less crowded, and he appreciated the quiet. The elevated temperature didn't bother him much. It reminded him of summer days back on Earth. He found a table in the corner, set down his bag, and pulled out his lunch. The thermal lab was maintained at a steady 45 degrees Celsius, Warm enough that most species found it comfortable, but not overwhelming. For dragonkin, it was like a pleasant spring day. For humans, it was like being in a hot room, noticeable but manageable. Jehun unwrapped his sandwich and opened his datapad to continue his reading. Around him, dragonkin students laughed and talked, enjoying a preferred environment. He was the only human in the room, but that was normal. Then a shadow fell across his table. Jehun looked up to find Arya standing there, her golden eyes fixed on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Behind her, several of her friends watched with barely concealed amusement. "This seat taken?" Arya asked, gesturing to the chair directly next to him. Jehun blinked in surprise. In 2 years at the academy, no dragonkin student had ever voluntarily sat near him, let alone next to him. No, it's free." "Great," Arya said, and sat down with a confident smile. She unpacked her own lunch, settling in as if this were perfectly normal. Jehun glanced at her, confused but not wanting to be rude. He returned his attention to his datapad, taking a bite of his sandwich. The temperature in the room pressed against his skin like a warm blanket, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. He had grown up in a coastal city where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees. Arya watched him from the corner of her eye, waiting for the first signs of discomfort. Surely the human would start sweating soon, would fidget, would need to leave for cooler air. That was when the real entertainment would begin. But minutes passed, and Jehun simply continued eating his lunch and reading his notes. He took a sip of water, turned a page on his datapad, and remained perfectly calm. Arya frowned. This wasn't going as planned. She had expected immediate discomfort, visible struggle. Instead, the human seemed completely unbothered by the heat that most humans supposedly found oppressive. At another table, her friends watched with growing confusion. Samin caught Arya's eye and made a questioning gesture. Arya could only shrug slightly, trying to maintain her confident expression. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Jehun finished a sandwich and started on an apple, his attention never leaving his studies. A thin sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead, barely noticeable, but he showed no other signs of distress. Arya felt her own confidence wavering. This was supposed to be funny, supposed to prove human fragility. Instead, she was sitting next to a boy who seemed more focused on his homework than on the fact that he was sitting in what should have been an uncomfortable environment for his species. She cleared her throat. "Don't you find it warm in here?" Jehun looked up, seeming surprised that she had spoken. "A bit," he said with a small shrug. "But it's fine. Reminds me of home, actually." "Home?" Arya asked, curiosity overriding her original plan. "Yeah, I'm from a coastal city. Summer temperatures were usually around this level. You get used to it." He said it so casually, as if sitting in 45-degree heat was just a normal part of life. Then he returned to his reading, apparently considering the conversation over. Arya sat back in her chair, her joke falling completely flat. Around the cafeteria, her friends were trying not to laugh at her failed challenge. She had expected to embarrass the human, to confirm her assumptions about their weakness. Instead, Jehun sat beside her, completely comfortable, absorbed in his studies, as if she wasn't even there. And for the first time in her life, Arya found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated humans. The joke had failed spectacularly, and Arya couldn't stop thinking about it. 3 days had passed since she sat next to Jehun in the thermal lab, and her friends still teased her about it. What was supposed to be a harmless prank to prove human weakness had instead left her with more questions than answers. She found herself watching Jehun in their shared classes, studying him the way she might study a puzzle. He moved through the academy with quiet efficiency, never drawing attention to himself, never complaining. While other students from temperature-sensitive species constantly adjusted the climate controls around them, Jehun seemed content in almost any environment. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, Professor Miho announced a practical demonstration in the environmental training chamber. The class would be testing their thermal tolerance in controlled conditions. It was a routine exercise, something they did every semester. But this time Arya paid closer attention than usual. The environmental chamber was a large circular room with transparent walls, allowing observers to watch safely from outside. Inside, the temperature could be adjusted from freezing cold to extreme heat. Students would enter in groups based on their species' comfort zones, and their responses would be monitored and recorded. The Dragonkin students went first, naturally. They filed into the chamber as Professor Miho raised the temperature to 60 degrees Celsius. Most species would find this uncomfortable. For Dragonkin, it was like a pleasant warm day. They stood casually, chatting among themselves, showing no signs of stress. The professor increased it to 70 degrees, then 80. Still, the Dragonkin remained comfortable, some even looking bored. Arya stood with her arms crossed, feeling the heat wrap around her like a familiar embrace. This was what her species was built for. This was their strength. Around her, her friends demonstrated the same easy confidence. When the temperature reached 90 degrees, Professor Miho finally stopped and made notes on his datapad. Other species took their turns. The Aquarians barely managed 40 degrees before requesting to leave. The crystalline beings preferred cooler temperatures and stayed only briefly. Each species had their range, their comfort zone, and they stayed within it. Then it was the humans' turn. There were only 3 human students in the class: Jehun, a girl named Dian, and a boy named Hyun. They entered the chamber together, and Professor Miho started at a moderate 35 degrees Celsius. Arya watched from outside with the rest of the class. She expected the humans to struggle, to prove what everyone assumed about their fragility. The professor slowly increased the temperature. 40 degrees. 45. 50. The humans remained standing, their postures relaxed. At 55 degrees, Arya noticed something. The humans were sweating, visibly so. Their skin glistened with moisture, and they frequently wiped their faces. It looked uncomfortable, even painful. Several students around her made comments about human weakness, about how they clearly couldn't handle what Dragonkin found comfortable. But Professor Miho kept increasing the temperature. 60 degrees. 65. The humans were sweating heavily now, their clothes damp, their faces flushed. They looked miserable, but they didn't ask to leave. They didn't even move toward the door. Arya leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Jehun. He stood with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and controlled. Sweat ran down his face, but his expression remained calm. It was the same look he had when he was reading in the library, focused and distant. At 70 degrees, Professor Miho finally stopped. "You can exit now," he said through the intercom. The humans walked out slowly, their movements careful but steady. As soon as they cleared the door, they grabbed bottles of water and drank deeply. Their clothes were soaked through, and they looked exhausted. But they had lasted until the professor told them to stop. They hadn't quit. Professor Miho pulled up the monitoring data on the large display screen. "Look at these readings carefully," he said to the class. The Dragonkin students showed no stress at 90 degrees Celsius. Their body temperatures remained stable, their heart rates normal. This is natural thermal resistance. He switched to the human data. Now look at the humans. At 70 degrees, their core body temperatures had risen to 39 degrees Celsius. That's approaching fever levels for their species. Their heart rates were elevated, their bodies working hard to cool down through sweat evaporation. A crystalline student raised a glowing appendage. So they were suffering? That proves they're not suited for heat. Does it? Professor Miho asked. They stayed in the chamber for the same duration as species with natural heat resistance. Yes, their bodies were under stress. But stress and failure are not the same thing. The question isn't whether they were comfortable. The question is whether they could function. He pulled up historical data. Let me show you something from Earth's history. There are records of human endurance events called marathons. Humans would run over 40 kilometers in conditions exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. Their body temperatures would rise above 39 degrees. They would lose liters of water through sweat, and they would keep running. The classroom was quiet now. Even the Dragonkin students had stopped their casual conversations. There are records of humans crossing deserts, working in extreme heat for hours, fighting fires and temperatures that would kill most species within minutes. They don't survive these conditions through resistance. They survive through persistence, through the ability to keep functioning even when their bodies are screaming at them to stop. Arya stared at the data on the screen. The human body temperature readings looked dangerous, critical even, but the humans had never shown panic, never begged to leave. They had simply endured. After class, Arya found herself following Jehun at a distance. She wasn't sure why. Curiosity, maybe, or perhaps something else she couldn't quite name. He went to the library, as he always did, and settled into his usual corner with a stack of books and his datapad. For 10 minutes, Arya stood in the doorway, debating with herself. Finally, she walked over to his table. "Can I sit here?" Jehun looked up, surprised to see her again. "Sure." She sat down across from him, not next to him this time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jehun returned to his reading, apparently content to ignore her presence. "Why didn't you leave?" Arya asked finally. "In the chamber, you were clearly uncomfortable. Why didn't you just ask to exit?" Jehun looked up, his expression thoughtful. "The professor didn't tell us to leave yet. Why would I quit before the exercise was over?" "Because it was hurting you. Your body was under stress." "Stress isn't the same as damage," Jehun said, echoing Professor Miho's words. "I knew my limits. I wasn't in danger. It was just uncomfortable." "Just uncomfortable," Arya repeated. "You were sweating like you've been running for hours." "That's how we cool down. It's supposed to happen." Jehun tilted his head slightly. "Why does this bother you so much?" Arya opened her mouth, then closed it. Why did it bother her? She had spent years knowing her place in the Academy's hierarchy. Dragonkin were strong, powerful, superior. Everyone acknowledged it. But this quiet human boy seemed completely unaware that he was supposed to be impressed by her. "I thought humans were fragile," she said finally. "Everyone says you are. You need climate control, special accommodations. But you stood in that chamber looking like you were dying, and you didn't quit." "We're not fragile," Jehun said quietly. "We're just different. Your species evolved to resist heat. Mine evolved to endure it. There's a difference." "What difference?" Jehun thought for a moment. "You're like a fortress. Strong walls, unmovable. We're like water. We're not strong, but we flow around obstacles. We adapt. We keep going." He paused. "On Earth, there's a saying, the stone that's strongest can crack under pressure. But water never breaks. It just keeps moving." Arya sat back in her chair, processing this. She had never thought about strength in those terms. To her, strength was power, dominance, the ability to stand unmoved against any challenge. The idea that weakness could be a different kind of strength seemed contradictory. But she couldn't deny what she had seen. The humans in that chamber had looked weak, had looked like they were suffering. But they hadn't broken. They had endured. Over the next few days, Arya found herself seeking out Jehun more often. At first, she told herself it was just curiosity, a desire to understand something that contradicted her worldview. But gradually, she realized she actually enjoyed talking to him. He didn't treat her like royalty or compete with her for status. He just talked to her like a normal person. She learned that Jehun had grown up in a coastal city where temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees in summer. His family couldn't afford advanced climate control, so he had simply learned to live with the heat. He told her about playing outside as a child, running and exploring while the sun beat down relentlessly. "Didn't it hurt?" Arya asked one afternoon as they studied together in the library. "Sometimes," Jehun admitted, "but you get used to it. Your body adapts. You learn to pace yourself, to drink enough water, to recognize when you need to rest. It becomes normal." "That sounds terrible." Jehun laughed softly. "Maybe, but it taught me something important. It taught me that discomfort is temporary, that you can push through things that seem impossible if you just take it one step at a time." Arya pulled up her datapad and started searching through the Academy's database. She had begun researching human history in her spare time, something she never thought she would do. The more she learned, the more disturbed and fascinated she became. She found records of human persistence hunting, exactly as Professor Miho had described. Videos showed humans jogging after prey animals for hours under the blazing sun. The prey would sprint away, then stop to pant and cool down. The human would catch up, and the chase would continue. Eventually, the animal would collapse from heat exhaustion, its cooling system overwhelmed. The human, though tired and covered in sweat, would still be functioning. She found records of endurance events. Humans running hundreds of kilometers through deserts. Humans climbing mountains where the air was thin and cold. Humans exploring environments that should have killed them, and somehow surviving through sheer determination. There were military records, too. Human soldiers marching through deserts carrying heavy equipment. Firefighters running into burning buildings to save others. Rescue workers operating in extreme conditions for hours, pushing their bodies to the limit and beyond. One record particularly caught her attention. It was a study on human thermoregulation during extreme exertion. The data showed that trained humans could maintain physical activity even when their core body temperature reached 40 degrees Celsius, a temperature that would cause brain damage in most species. They did this by maximizing sweat production and airflow, creating a cooling effect that allowed them to continue functioning. The report noted that this ability came at a cost. Humans needed constant hydration. They lost dangerous amounts of water and electrolytes. Their bodies were pushed to the edge of survival, but they could do it. They could operate in conditions that forced other species to stop and rest. Arya showed the data to Salmon one evening. Her friend looked at the numbers with growing disbelief. "This can't be right," Salmon said. "If their body temperature rises as high, they should be unconscious or dead." "But they're not," Arya said. "That's the point. They evolved to function even when their bodies are cooking from the inside. That's horrifying." "Or impressive," Arya said quietly. "Depends on how you look at it." Salmon gave her a strange look. "Since when do you care about humans?" Since one of them had shattered her assumptions about weakness and strength, Arya thought, but she didn't say that out loud. Instead, she changed the subject and tried to ignore the fact that her view of the universe was shifting in ways she didn't fully understand yet. She found Jehun before class and walked up to him with her usual confidence, though inside she felt uncertain in a way she rarely experienced. "I want to challenge you," she said. Jehun looked up from his datapad, his expression curious but not surprised. "Challenge me to what?" "The thermal gauntlet. You know what that is?" Everyone knew about the thermal gauntlet. It was the Academy's most famous endurance test, a 1-kilometer obstacle course through progressively hotter environments. Dragonkin students had dominated it for decades. "I know it," Jehun said carefully. "Why would you want to challenge me?" "Because I need to know," Arya said. "I need to understand if what I've been reading is true. I need to see it for myself." Jehun studied her face for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled slightly. "Okay, when?" "This weekend, in front of everyone." Arya felt her competitive nature rising. "I want everyone to see." "See what?" "Me lose." "Maybe," Arya said. "Or maybe see something they've never seen before. Either way, I need to know the truth." Jehun closed his datapad and stood up. He was shorter than Arya, less physically imposing. Nothing about him suggesting he could compete with a dragonkin in an endurance challenge. But his eyes were calm and steady as he met her gaze. "All right," he said simply. "Let's find out." News of the challenge spread through the Academy like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone was talking about it. A dragonkin challenging a human to the thermal gauntlet. It seemed like a joke, another example of humans not knowing their place. But Arya wasn't joking, and as she prepared for the weekend, she realized that part of her hope Jehun would prove everyone wrong. She hoped he would show that quiet endurance could match raw power. She hoped, though she barely admitted it to herself, that she was right about humans being more than what they seemed. The viewing gallery above the thermal gauntlet was packed with students from every species. Word spread fast, and everyone wanted to see the dragonkin girl challenge a human boy to what seemed like an impossible contest. Most came expecting entertainment, a quick demonstration of why humans were considered the weakest species in the Academy. A few came out of genuine curiosity, and some came because they sensed this might be more interesting than anyone expected. Jehun stood at the starting line, wearing simple athletic clothes and carrying 2 large water bottles. He looked small compared to the massive entrance of the gauntlet, a tunnel that stretched into the distance with warning lights flashing along its walls. The air near the entrance already shimmered with heat, even though the course hadn't been fully activated yet. Arya arrived with her usual group of friends. She wore traditional dragonkin athletic gear, designed to enhance rather than protect against heat. Her crimson horns gleamed under the artificial lights, and her golden eyes were fixed on the course ahead. She looked every bit the confident warrior her species was known for producing. Samin pulled Arya aside before the challenge began. "Are you sure about this? Everyone's watching. If he collapses in the first 100 meters, you'll look like you're bullying him." "He won't collapse," Arya said, surprised at herself with the certainty in her voice. "I've been watching him. He's tougher than he looks." "He's a human," Samin replied, as if that explained everything. "They're not built for this." "We'll see," Arya said quietly. Professor Miho appeared, checking the safety systems and monitoring equipment. He looked at both competitors with an expression that was hard to read. "You both understand the core structure? The temperature increases every 250 meters. You can exit at any time through the side doors. If your core temperature reaches critical levels, the system will automatically eject you. This is about endurance, not about proving anything stupid." Both Jehun and Arya nodded. The professor studied them for another moment, then stepped back. "Whenever you're ready." They took their positions at the starting line. Around them, the crowd quieted, everyone leaning forward to watch. Arya glanced at Jehun one more time. He was stretching his legs, his movements calm and methodical. He didn't look nervous or intimidated. He looked like someone preparing for a long workout. The starting signal flashed green. They began. The first section of the gauntlet was set at 50 degrees Celsius. For both of them, it was manageable. The course required them to climb over obstacles, crawl through narrow passages, and navigate around barriers. It wasn't just about heat tolerance, but also about physical endurance. Arya moved with the grace and power her species was famous for. She vaulted over obstacles easily, her natural strength making the physical challenges seem simple. Behind her, Jehun moved more carefully, using technique rather than raw power. He planned each movement, conserving energy, never rushing. By the end of the first section, Arya was well ahead. She glanced back and saw Jehun still moving steadily, about 50 meters behind her. Sweat was already visible on his face, but his pace hadn't changed. He moved like a machine, consistent and unrelenting. The second section brought the temperature to 80 degrees Celsius. Now the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The air itself seemed thick and hard to breathe. This was where most non-heat resistant species would begin to struggle seriously. Arya felt the heat embrace her, like an old friend. This was her element, her natural environment. She picked up her pace, confident that the human behind her would start to slow down. Dragonkin always dominated this section. Always. But when she glanced back again, Jehun was still there. He was sweating heavily now, his clothes darkened with moisture. But he hadn't slowed down. If anything, his pace had become more focused, more determined. His breathing was controlled, steady despite the heat. Arya frowned and pushed harder. She wasn't going to let a human keep up with her. The obstacles in this section were more challenging, requiring upper body strength to pull yourself over walls and through elevated passages. She used her natural power to blast through them. Jehun reached the same obstacles and paused for just a second, planning his approach. Then he moved, using momentum and technique to compensate for his lack of raw strength. He wasn't as fast as Arya, but he was still moving forward, still advancing. In the viewing gallery, the crowd was no longer laughing. Students watched in growing surprise as the human continued to the second section without any signs of stopping. Sure, he looked uncomfortable. His face was flushed red, and sweat poured off him in streams. But he wasn't quitting. Dian, the other human student, watched with a small smile. "Come on, Jehun," she whispered. "Show them." The third section was where things got serious. 120 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, most species can survive without special equipment. Even dragonkin felt the heat, though they could handle it. The air was like standing in front of an oven, every breath hot and harsh. Arya felt the temperature change immediately. It was no longer comfortable, but it was still within her tolerance. She had trained in environments like this since childhood. This was dragonkin territory, where they proved their superiority. She expected the human to quit here, to admit defeat and exit through one of the side doors. No shame in that. 120 degrees was genuinely dangerous for most species. But Jehun kept coming. His pace had finally slowed, but not stopped. He moved carefully now, taking frequent sips from his water bottles. His sweat evaporated almost instantly at this temperature, creating a visible shimmer around his body. He looked like he was in pain, his face tight with concentration. But he didn't stop. He didn't quit. Arya felt something strange in her chest. Not quite respect, not quite fear, but something between them. This human boy was pushing himself into dangerous territory, and he knew it. But he kept going anyway. The obstacles in this section were simpler but longer. Endurance challenges rather than strength challenges. Long corridors to traverse. Stairs to climb. Distances to cover while the heat tried to break you down. Arya moved through them, but for the first time, she felt herself tiring. Not from the heat, but from the sustained effort. She had expected to sprint through this course, to finish quickly and decisively. Instead, she found herself in a real endurance test. Behind her, Jehun had fallen further back, but he was still visible, still moving. His water bottles were half empty now, and his clothes were completely soaked. But his feet kept moving forward, one step after another, mechanical and relentless. In the viewing gallery, Professor Miho watched the biometric data with a complicated expression. Jehun's core temperature was approaching 39 degrees Celsius. High, but not yet dangerous. His heart rate was elevated, but steady. Every system in his body was working overtime to keep him functional. He should stop, one of the Aquarian students said. Those readings look dangerous. They look human, Professor Mio replied quietly. This is what they do. They push right up to the edge and keep functioning. The fourth and final section was a nightmare zone, 160 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the metal walls of the gauntlet glowed with heat. The air itself seemed to burn going into your lungs. This section was shorter than the others, but it was the ultimate test of thermal endurance. Arya entered it and felt the heat slam into her like a physical force. Even for dragonkin, this was at the edge of their tolerance. She could handle it, but it took concentration, focus, and will. The obstacles here were minimal. Just a 400-meter straight path to the finish line. Just you against the heat. She pushed forward, her pride demanding that she finish strong. Behind her, somewhere in the previous section, the human was still coming. She couldn't believe it, couldn't understand it, but she knew he wouldn't quit. Not now. Not after coming this far. Arya crossed into the final section and immediately understood why this was a nightmare zone. The heat was crushing, oppressive. It felt like being inside a star. Her natural resistance protected her, but it was still overwhelming. She moved as fast as she dared, knowing that even dragonkin couldn't stay in this environment indefinitely. She was halfway through when she heard footsteps behind her. Impossible. She turned her head and saw him. Jehun had entered the final section. He looked like death. His face was bright red, his eyes half closed against the heat. Sweat no longer ran down his skin because it evaporated instantly. Steam rose from his body like he was boiling from the inside. Every breath looked painful, every step an act of pure will. But he was moving, slowly, carefully, but moving. His eyes were fixed on the finish line ahead, and nothing else seemed to exist for him. Arya forgot about her own race. She stood there, watching this impossible sight. A human, in 160-degree heat, still walking forward. It defied everything she thought she knew. It shouldn't be possible. Then she saw his legs start to shake, saw him stumble slightly. He was at his limit, maybe past it. In a few more steps, he would collapse. And at this temperature, that could be fatal. Arya made a decision without thinking. She ran back toward him, closing the distance in seconds. She grabbed his arm and pulled it over her shoulders, supporting his weight. "What are you doing?" Jehun mumbled, his voice rough and dry. "Finishing this," Arya said. "Together. Come on." She half-carried, half-dragged him toward the finish line. His weight was nothing to her dragonkin strength, but she felt every step he tried to take, every effort he made to keep moving even when his body was shutting down. They crossed the finish line together. The moment they did, the emergency systems activated, spraying them with cool water and dropping the temperature rapidly. Medical staff rushed forward with cooling blankets and electrolyte solutions. Arya lowered Jehun to the ground carefully. Medics surrounded him immediately, checking his vitals and core temperature. She heard them talking in worried voices about hypothermia and heat stroke. But even as they worked on him, Jehun's eyes found hers. "Did I finish?" he asked. "Yeah," Arya said softly. "You finished." "Good," he whispered. And then his eyes closed as the medics took over. In the viewing gallery, the crowd was completely silent. No one knew what to say. They had just watched a human push himself to the absolute edge of survival, had watched him keep going when he should have collapsed, and they had watched a dragonkin help him across the finish line instead of claiming her victory alone. Salmon found Arya sitting outside the medical bay an hour later. Her friend sat down beside her, without saying anything for a long moment. "Why did you help him?" Salmon asked finally. "You would have won. You would have set a record time." "I know," Arya said. "So why?" Arya thought about the question. She thought about what she had seen in that final section. A human boy pushing past every reasonable limit, defying his body's desperate signals to stop, continuing purely through determination and will. Because, she said slowly, winning wasn't the point anymore. Understanding was. And I finally understood. Understood what? That humans aren't weak. They're just terrifying in a different way. We're built to withstand. They're built to persist. And persistence is its own kind of strength. Arya looked at her hands, still feeling the weight of Jehun's arm across her shoulders. We dragons pride ourselves on being unbreakable. But humans? They break and keep going anyway. That's not weakness. That's something else entirely. Salmon didn't have an answer to that. Neither did Arya. Not really. But as she sat there waiting for news about Jehun's condition, she knew that something had changed. Not just in her understanding of humans, but in her understanding of what strength really meant. The thermal gauntlet had been meant to prove dragonkin superiority. Instead, it had revealed something far more important. Something that Arya was only beginning to comprehend. Jehun spent 2 days in the medical bay. The doctor said he had pushed himself dangerously close to heat stroke, that his core temperature had reached 40 degrees Celsius, and that any other species would have suffered permanent damage. But human bodies were strange things, built to recover from extremes that should have killed them. By the 2nd day, he was sitting up and reading, looking tired but otherwise normal. Arya visited him every day. At first, she told herself it was just a check on him, to make sure her challenge hadn't caused permanent harm. But truthfully, she wanted to understand him better. Wanted to understand how someone could push themselves that far, and then just bounce back like it was nothing unusual. On the 3rd day, Jehun was clear to return to classes. When he walked into the advanced xenobiology classroom, the entire room went quiet. Students who had never paid attention to him before now watched him with new eyes. Some with respect, some with confusion, and some with something that looked like fear. He took his usual seat in the back corner, pulling out his datapad as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Arya could see it in the way other students gave him space, in the way conversations stopped when he walked by. The quiet human boy had done something impossible, and no one knew quite how to react. Arya sat down next to him. It wasn't a joke this time. It was a choice. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Tired," Jehun admitted, "but okay. The doctor said I should avoid extreme heat for a week or so. Let my body fully recover. You almost died, you know, in that final section." "I know." He said it so calmly, like he was discussing the weather, "but I didn't. That's what matters." Arya shook her head. "Does nothing scare you?" "Lots of things scare me," Jehun said with a slight smile. But being uncomfortable isn't one of them. I grew up learning that discomfort is temporary, that you can survive things that feel impossible in the moment. Before Arya could respond, Professor Miho entered and began the day's lecture. The topic was survival adaptations in extreme environments. Given recent events, the timing felt almost intentional. The professor pulled up data from various species, showing how each had developed unique solutions to environmental challenges. Then he pulled up the recordings from the Thermal Gauntlet Challenge. The entire class watched in silence as the footage played. It looked even more impressive from the outside cameras. You could see Arya moving through the course with dragonkin power and grace. And you could see Jehun, smaller and slower, but never stopping, never giving up. The moment when Arya turned back to help him cross the finish line played in slow motion. This, Professor Miho said, is what I want you to understand about adaptation. It's not always about being the strongest or the most resistant. Sometimes it's about being able to continue when every logical signal tells you to stop. He zoomed in on Jihun's biometric data from the final section. Look at these readings. Core temperature at 40 degrees. Heart rate at 170 beats per minute. Severe dehydration. Every system in his body was screaming danger. But humans evolved with an override function. They can consciously push past their body's warning signals when they choose to. A student from the back raised a crystalline appendage. But isn't that just stupid? Ignoring your body's signals can kill you. It can, the professor agreed, but it can also save you. Imagine you're being chased by a predator. Your body says stop, you're tired, you can't continue. Most species would have to stop, but humans can decide to keep running anyway. They can literally run themselves to death if they choose. That's terrifying from an evolutionary perspective. He changed the display to show human endurance records. Ultramarathons covering hundreds of kilometers. Persistence hunts lasting 8 hours or more. Military training exercises that push human bodies to their absolute limits. Humans don't have natural weapons, Professor Miho continued. They're not particularly fast or strong compared to other predators, but they have this ability to just keep going, to outlast everything else through sheer determination. On their home planet, they were persistence predators. They would choose a target and follow it until it died of exhaustion, not because they were faster, but because they never stopped. Arya listened, thinking about what she had seen. Jehun in that final section, his body clearly failing, but still moving forward. It wasn't strength in any traditional sense. It was something else, something more disturbing and impressive at the same time. After class, several students approached Jehun. Some wanted to congratulate him. Others wanted to ask questions about human physiology. A few of the Dragonkin students, who had previously ignored him, now treated him with cautious respect. But Jehun handled it all with the same quiet demeanor he always had. He answered questions politely, accepted congratulations with a simple thank you, and then returned to his studies. He didn't seem interested in his new status or attention. He was just himself, unchanged by what everyone else thought. That afternoon, Arya found herself in the library again, researching human history. But this time, she was looking for something specific. She wanted to understand not just human physical capabilities, but their mental ones. What made them able to override their survival instincts? She found psychological studies from Earth, research on human persistence and mental endurance. One study particularly caught her attention. It was about something called the central governor theory, the idea that human exhaustion wasn't just physical but mental, that the body would send distress signals long before actual failure, try and protect itself, and that humans could learn to recognize these signals and push past them safely. Another study discussed human pain tolerance and the ability to compartmentalize suffering. It showed that humans could function at high levels even while experiencing significant discomfort by mentally separating the sensation from their decision-making process. Arya found records of human explorers, people who had pushed into environments that should have killed them. Arctic expeditions where humans survived temperatures far below freezing. Desert crossings where they endured extreme heat and water scarcity. Mountain climbers who reached altitudes where oxygen was scarce, forcing their bodies to adapt or die. In every case, the common thread was mental fortitude, the ability to keep making the decision to continue, step after step, breath after breath, even when everything hurt. She was so absorbed in her research that she didn't notice Salmon sitting down across from her until her friend spoke. "You've been spending a lot of time studying humans lately." Arya looked up. "I'm trying to understand them." "Why? You prove your point. You finished the gauntlet. Everyone saw that you're stronger." "Am I, though?" Arya asked. "I finished first, yes, but only because I have natural advantages. If we were both baseline, with no special adaptations, who would have made it further?" Salmon frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean I was comfortable for most of that course. It was only hard at the very end. But Jehun was suffering from the first section. Every step was difficult for him, and he still made it to the end." Arya closed her datapad. "That's not weakness. That's something else entirely. You sound like you admire him." Arya thought about that. "Maybe I do. Not because he's strong in the way we understand strength, but because he showed me that there are different kinds of power. We dragonkin are built to dominate, but humans, they're built to endure, and endurance might be more valuable than dominance." Over the next few weeks, Arya and Jehun began studying together regularly. At first, other students found it strange. A dragonkin and a human, two species at opposite ends of the power spectrum, working side by side. But gradually it became normal. Arya learned more about Earth and human culture. Jehun told her about his home city, about the heat and humidity that shaped his childhood, about learning to play sports in temperatures that would make most species retreat indoors, about his grandmother, who had worked outdoors her entire life, never complaining about the sun or heat. "Humans complain a lot," Jehun said with a smile. "But complaining and quitting are different things. We'll tell you we're tired, hot, uncomfortable, but we'll keep working anyway. It's just how we're built." In return, Arya told him about dragonkin culture, about the pride her people took in their natural abilities, about the pressure to prove yourself strong, to never show weakness or vulnerability, about how she had been raised to see other species as inferior, especially those without natural advantages. "I was wrong," she admitted one evening as they worked on a project together. "I thought you were weak because you needed accommodations, because you couldn't naturally survive in extreme conditions. But I didn't understand that needing accommodations isn't the same as being weak. It just means you're adaptive for different challenges." "We're all adaptive for something," Jehun said. "Dragonkin are adaptive for power and heat resistance. Aquarians for underwater environments. Humans for endurance and adaptability. None of it makes anyone better or worse. Just different." Their friendship didn't go unnoticed. Some students thought it was odd. Others saw it as a positive sign, proof that different species could understand and respect each other. But most people just accepted it as another quirk of academy life. One day, Professor Miho announced a new project. Students would be paired across species lines to study cooperative survival strategies. The goal was to understand how different adaptations could work together rather than compete. When the pairings were announced, Arya and Jehun were assigned together. It felt inevitable somehow, like the universe had decided they needed to continue learning from each other. Their project focused on rescue operations in extreme environments. They researched scenarios where different species' abilities could complement each other. Dragonkin strength and heat resistance, combined with human endurance and problem-solving. Aquarian water navigation with human land mobility. Crystalline energy manipulation with human manual dexterity. As they worked, Arya realized something important. The Thermal Gauntlet Challenge hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about understanding, about seeing past the surface assumptions and recognizing that every species had value, had strengths, had something to contribute. She thought about the moment she had turned back to help Jehun. At the time, she had acted on instinct, not wanting to see him collapse in that dangerous heat. But now she understood it had been something more. It had been the recognition that his success was as important as her own, that they weren't really competing against each other, but against their own limits and assumptions. Late one evening, as they finished their project presentation, Jehun asked her a question that had apparently been on his mind for a while. Why did you challenge me to the gauntlet? Really? Arya thought carefully before answering. Because I needed to know. I had spent my whole life believing dragonkin were superior to humans, that your species was weak and fragile. But then you sat next to me in that thermal lab and didn't even flinch at the heat. And it bothered me. It challenged everything I thought I knew. So you wanted to prove I was weak after all? Maybe at first, Arya admitted, but somewhere during that challenge, my goal changed. I stopped wanting to prove you weak and started wanting to understand your strength. Because you have strength, Jehun. It's just not the kind I was taught to recognize. Jehun smiled. You have strength too, not just physical power, but the strength to change your mind, to admit when you're wrong. A lot of people can't do that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two very different beings who had somehow become friends through fire and determination. Outside the library windows, the Academy's artificial sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the distance, other students laughed and talked, unaware that something important had happened. That two species had bridged a gap and found understanding where there had only been assumption. The hellish heat that had brought them together wasn't just the physical temperature of the thermal gauntlet. It was a burning away of prejudice and ignorance, leaving behind something stronger and more valuable: understanding, respect, friendship, and perhaps, in a universe full of different species all learning to coexist, that was the most important discovery of all. The emergency alarm shattered the peaceful afternoon at Galactic Unity Academy. Students looked up from their studies, confused at first, then concerned as the sound continued. Emergency drills were common, but this didn't sound like a drill. The alarm had a desperate urgency to it that made everyone freeze. Professor Miho's voice came through the intercom system, tight with stress. This is not a drill. We have a critical situation in the science wing. A solar flare has damaged our thermal regulation systems. Temperature is rising rapidly in sections D through G. All students in those areas need to evacuate immediately. All other students remain in your current locations. Arya was in the library with Jehun when the announcement came. They both looked at each other, then toward the windows that faced the science wing. Already, they could see students streaming out of the exits, some moving quickly, others being helped by friends. Section D. Jehun said quietly, reading the emergency display on his datapad. That's where the junior students have their afternoon labs. Arya pulled up the same information on her device. Her face went pale. The Aquarian younglings. They're in Section F for their environmental studies class. If the temperature is rising, they can't survive long in heat. The intercom crackled again. Rescue teams are assembling. However, internal sensors show temperatures in the affected areas are already reaching 70 degrees Celsius and climbing. Most species cannot safely operate in these conditions for extended periods. We need volunteers who can tolerate extreme heat. Without thinking, Arya stood up. I'm going. Jehun stood too. So am I? She looked at him sharply. You just recovered from the gauntlet. The doctors said you need to avoid extreme heat. The doctors said I need to avoid it for training purposes. Jehun corrected. This isn't training. Those are real students in real danger. His voice was calm, but his eyes were determined. Besides, you know what humans can do. You've seen it yourself. Arya wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Humans had operated in high heat longer than most species, even if it hurt them. And right now, they needed everyone who could help. They ran toward the assembly point near the science wing entrance. Other students were gathered there, mostly dragonkin who could handle the heat. A few magma dwellers, too, their rock-like bodies immune to most thermal damage. But it wasn't many. Most species simply couldn't survive in environments above 60 degrees for more than a few minutes. Professor Miho was coordinating the rescue efforts, his face grim. When he saw Jehun, he shook his head. You shouldn't be here. You're still recovering. With respect, Professor, I'm here anyway, Jehun said, and you need everyone you can get. Two other human students appeared, Dian and Hyun, both from their xenobiology class. They looked scared but determined. We can help, Dean said. Humans can handle heat stress. You taught us it yourself. The professor looked at the three humans, then at the thermal readings on his display. The numbers were climbing steadily. 80 degrees in some corridors now. Soon it would be too hot even for Dragonkin to operate safely for long periods. Fine, he said finally, but you work in teams. Dragonkin and humans together. The Dragonkin can handle the heat better, but humans have endurance to make multiple trips if needed. Understood? Everyone nodded. Professor Miho quickly organized them into pairs. Arya and Jehun were naturally paired together. Saman was paired with Dian. Other Dragonkin students were matched with a few other heat-tolerant species available. The professor pulled up a map of the affected areas. Section D has been mostly evacuated, but we have reports of 3 students trapped in a collapsed doorway. Section E is clear. Section F has the real problem. 12 Aquarian younglings and their instructor are trapped in the environmental lab. The cooling systems in that room fail first. They're in an air-conditioned safe room, but it's only rated for 30 degrees and climbing. They have maybe 20 minutes before it becomes dangerous for them. 20 minutes. Arya felt her heart race. The route to Section F went through corridors that were now reading 90 degrees Celsius. For Dragonkin, that was manageable, but the Aquarian younglings couldn't be moved through those temperatures without protection. We need thermal blankets. Jehun said suddenly, the emergency kind that reflect heat. If we wrap the younglings in those, we can move them quickly through the hot zones. Professor Miho nodded sharply. Good thinking. Grab them from the emergency stations as you go in. Move fast but stay safe. If conditions become too dangerous, retreat immediately. No dead heroes. Understood. They all acknowledged and moved toward the entrance. Arya could feel the heat radiating from the doorway even before they entered. It hit her like a wave when they crossed the threshold, pressing against her skin with familiar intensity. For her, it was uncomfortable but bearable. She glanced at Jehun and saw sweat already forming on his forehead. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. Let's move. They ran to the corridors, following the emergency lighting. The first team broke off to help the trapped students in Section D. Arya and Jehun continued deeper into the science wing, towards Section F. The heat intensified with every step. Arya's internal sensors told her they were now in an environment of 95 degrees Celsius. Her natural resistance protected her, but even she was starting to feel the strain. Beside her, Jehun's breathing had become heavier, more labored. His clothes were already soaked with sweat. Jehun, maybe you should... Keep going, he interrupted, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. Those kids don't have time for me to slow down. They reached an emergency supply station and grabbed thermal blankets, lightweight reflective sheets designed to protect against extreme temperatures. Then they pushed forward again. The corridor leading to Section F was the worst. The temperature display on the wall read 105 degrees Celsius. The metal walls were hot to the touch, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Arya moved through it, her body handling the temperature but feeling the strain. Behind her, she heard Jehun's footsteps, slower now but still coming. She turned and saw him, one hand against the wall for balance, his face bright red, but his eyes focused on the path ahead. Almost there, she said, though she wasn't sure she was reassuring him or herself. They reached the safe room door. Through the small window, Arya could see the Aquarian younglings huddled together, their instructor trying to keep them calm. Aquarians were water-based beings, designed for cool environments. Even in the safe room, they looked distressed. Their skin had taken on a dull color, and several of the smaller ones were barely moving. Arya opened the door, and a blast of relatively cool air hit them. Inside, it was maybe 40 degrees, hot for Aquarians, but a relief compared to the corridor. The Aquarian instructor, a female named Mira, looked up with desperate hope. Can you get us out? Yes, Arya said with more confidence than she felt. We have thermal blankets. We'll wrap the younglings and carry them through the hot zones. It'll be quick, but it will work. Jehun was already moving, spreading out the thermal blankets and showing the younglings how to wrap themselves. Despite his obvious exhaustion, his hands were steady. his voice calm. Don't be scared. This will protect you from the heat. We're going to move fast, and then you'll be safe. Okay. The younglings nodded, their large eyes trusting. Within minutes, all 12 were wrapped in protective blankets. But they were small and weak from the heat. They couldn't walk through the corridors on their own. We'll have to carry them, Mira said. But I can't manage in that heat, not while carrying anyone. Arya looked at the younglings, then at Jehun, 12 younglings, 2 rescuers, multiple trips through corridors that were now probably reaching 110 degrees. We can do this, Jehun said quietly. You can carry more at once with your strength. I'll take 1 or 2 at a time. We make as many trips as needed. Arya wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too dangerous for him, but there was no time for arguments. She picked up 4 of the smaller younglings, her dragonkin strength making their weight manageable. Jehun lifted one of the larger ones in his arms, wrapping his own body around the thermal blanket for extra protection. They moved. The corridor was even hotter now. Arya felt her body protesting, her natural resistance being pushed to its limits. Behind her, she heard Jehun's ragged breathing, but didn't dare turn around. If she saw him collapsing, she might stop, and stopping could mean death for the younglings they carried. The journey back felt like an eternity compressed into minutes. When they finally burst out of the science wing, emergency medical teams rushed forward to take the younglings. Arya lowered her 4 charges carefully, then turned to check on Jehun. He was on his knees, the youngling he carried safely transferred to medics. His entire body shook, and steam rose from his clothes. His core temperature had to be dangerously high, but he was already trying to stand. How many more? Jehun, you can't. How many more? He repeated, his voice hoarse but determined. 8, Arya admitted, plus the instructor. Jehun nodded and forced himself to his feet. Dian and Hyun appeared, having successfully completed their own rescue. Both looked exhausted, but functional. We'll help, Dian said. 4 more trips. We can do this. Together, the rescue teams made 3 more runs into the hellish heat of Section F. Each trip was harder than the last. The temperatures continued to climb. The corridors became almost unbearable even for dragonkin. But they kept going. On the final trip, Arya carried the last 2 younglings while Jehun supported the instructor. By now, his movements were mechanical, driven by pure will rather than physical ability. She could see his hands shaking, could hear his breath coming in short gasps. When they finally emerged with the last of the Aquarians, Jehun collapsed. Medical staff surrounded him immediately, checking vitals and administering emergency cooling treatments. His core temperature had reached 41 degrees Celsius, well into the danger zone for humans. But all 12 younglings were safe. Not one had been lost. Arya sat beside Jehun's medical bed later that evening. He was conscious, but under strict orders to rest. The doctor said he had pushed himself further than in the thermal gauntlet, that he was lucky to have survived without permanent damage. You know, Arya said softly, I used to think humans were weak because you needed so much help to survive. Special accommodations, temperature controls, all of that. And now, Jehun asked, his voice tired, now I understand. You need those accommodations because you evolved to push past your limits. You need protection because you're willing to sacrifice yourself when it matters. That's not weakness. That's a different kind of strength. Maybe the most important kind. She thought about what she had witnessed. Jehun, running into dangerous heat to save younglings of a species he barely knew, forcing his body to continue when it should have shut down, all because someone needed help. We dragons pride ourselves on being powerful, Arya continued, on being able to dominate our environment. But you humans, you taught me something more important. You taught me about endurance, about persistence, about doing what's right even when it hurts. She paused. The hellish heat I discovered wasn't just a physical temperature. It was a fire inside you, the determination that never quits. And that's more impressive than any natural ability. Jehun smiled weakly. We just do what needs to be done. No, Arya said firmly. You do what no one else can do. You push past every reasonable limit. And you do it without asking for recognition or reward. That's not just strength. That's heroism. In the days that followed, the story of the rescue spread throughout the academy. The human students who had risked their lives to save others became something of a legend. But more importantly, attitudes began to change. Students from other species started to see humans differently, not as weak, but as possessing a unique and valuable form of resilience. Arya sat in the cafeteria's thermal lab one afternoon, waiting. Jehun appeared with his lunch tray and walked directly to her table, sitting down beside her without hesitation. Around them, other students from various species mixed and talked, the old social hierarchies slowly breaking down. "You know," Arya said, "I'm glad you sat next to me that day, even if I meant it as a joke. Best joke anyone ever played on me." Jehun replied with a smile. "It introduced me to a good friend." Arya felt warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the elevated temperature of the room. Yeah, a good friend. They ate their lunch together in comfortable silence. Two beings from vastly different species who had discovered that strength came in many forms. The heat that surrounded them was no longer a barrier or a challenge. It was just background noise to a friendship forged in fire and mutual respect. The universe was full of different species, each with their own abilities and limitations. But perhaps the greatest ability of all was the capacity to learn, to grow, and to see past the surface to the truth beneath. Dragonkin weren't superior to humans. Humans weren't inferior to dragonkin. They were simply different, each with their own unique value. And in understanding that difference, in learning to appreciate rather than dismiss it, they had both become stronger than they ever could have been alone. The hellish heat had burned away ignorance and prejudice, leaving behind something pure and valuable: understanding, friendship, and the knowledge that true strength comes not from what you can naturally do, but from what you choose to do when it matters most.